One of my favorite studies over the last 10 years has been a study on the wise men. And it's Christmas theme, of course, which is always been a little difficult for me because we teach expositionally, and then you've got this season of like 3 weeks where you got to come up with the Christmas theme, and I'm like, what do I do? And this has just been one of my favorite studies. The wise men is a very interesting group of Christmas characters. And the truth is, as we go through this today, I think what we know about the wise men is about 95% tradition and 5% or less Bible. And for example, of the 4 gospel records, Matthew is the only one who tells about them. Mark and John don't even have the Christmas story. Luke is completely silent on the wise men. So we only have actually Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12 and verse 16 that even mentions the wise men. And yet, the wise men are such a huge part of the Christmas season. They even have a song. We 3 kings of Orient are the wise men. So today, I hope to answer these questions. Who were the wise men? Were they really kings? Did they ride camels? Were there 3? And are they really that significant? And I believe we'll answer those questions today. It's going to be a little bit more of a history lesson than a sermon today, but I hope you enjoy history as I do. If you don't, I get about 45 minutes and then it'll be over. They're actually very important, significant, much more than I believe we might understand. The term wise men or magi is the name of a priestly tribe within the ancient Mede people group. Similar to the 12 tribes of Israel, where the Levite tribe was the priestly tribe of the Jews, the Medes had a very similar tribe. They're called the Magi. Now, interestingly enough, I'm a financial planner, and there's actually an IRS acronym called the Magi. It's the Modified Adjusted Gross Income. And the Modified Adjusted Gross Income calculates how much of your Social Security retirement is taxable or how much health insurance premium tax credit you get. And it's 2 totally different calculations. They're the Magi. And so as I'm talking with clients and I point to the chart and I work out the Magi, I always say, now these are not wise men. And we all laugh. It was a very interesting group, the Magi. They actually served 4 of the several world powers throughout history. There's several that I'm sure you're familiar with, like the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. All 4 of those, the Magi played a significant role. They were skilled in astronomy, which is the study of the stars in the heavens. They're skilled in astrology, which is the belief that future and events can be determined by the study of planets and stars. It's really more of a false religion than anything. They didn't distinguish between science and religion, though. They were a pagan group. They were involved in sorcery. They were involved in divination, incantation, interpretation of dreams. That was like their skill set. In fact, we get our word magician or magic from the root word magi. Now, we don't know exactly when they came on the scene. There is some historians believe that their history can be dated all the way back to Ur of the Chaldeans as part of a nomadic group that wandered around that part of the world. I don't know, that there's no specific time as one of those questions that you can ask. Were you there? I don't know. But we do see them rise to prominence in the Babylonian time. Why do you think that is? Well, as you can imagine, in pagan societies and kingdoms, their skill set in sorcery and divination would be very attractive to a pagan king. And that's not exclusive to that time. In fact, there are a number of historical records that Nancy Reagan kept an astrologer close to her. That would help her, that she would try to glean wisdom from. But their original rise to power came during the Babylonian Empire, and yet they were able to transition from empire to empire, and their prominence grew as they went from empire to empire. So they went from the Babylonian to the Medo-Persian, ultimately to the Greek and Roman. Now, before we go any further, let me just say this. God is in control. He is in control of history. History is his story. He knows all things. He is in control of all things. And he can use all things to work together. Romans chapter 8 says, and we know. It's one of those things that we must transition from knowledge to reckoning. We must reckon it to be true. We must, in other words, live our life as if it is true. We know in all things God works together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. If you are a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, that is true. And I say this because God used the Magi. At some point, the Magi had become so prominently placed that they became sort of a royal advisor or advisors to the kings. And this is actually where we first see the wise men in the Bible. We see them in the Old Testament in the book of Daniel. We just saw Daniel chapter 10. In the book of Daniel, you have this highlighted story of Daniel's life. He was an Old Testament prophet, but also throughout the book you have prophecies of the future, including the end times. We looked at it briefly in Mark chapter 13 a few years ago. We will see it again as we get close to the end of Matthew. But the book begins with the captivity of Daniel and other Hebrew young men, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The practice of that day is when the empires would overtake a territory, they would take young men into captivity, specifically what's happening here in chapter 1. The Babylonian Empire would bring these prominent young men into the kingdom to indoctrinate them into the Babylonian practices, into their thought process, into their lifestyle. And then the king would use them for influence because they were prominent back where they were taken in captivity. They were then indoctrinated in the ways of the Babylonian Empire. And then the king could use them for influence back in their home territory. And so in that way, they were kind of advisors to the king. Daniel rose to that position within the Babylonian government. In Daniel chapter 2, you have a very interesting story. King Nebuchadnezzar, he awakens from a dream that was very disturbing to him. Now, Nebuchadnezzar did not believe in the Magi. He thought they were frauds. He didn't believe that they had this knowledge, that they were actually telling the truth. But he's so disturbed by this dream that he asks them for an interpretation without telling them the dream. He says, if you've got this power, then first tell me the dream and then tell me the interpretation. And so he really sets them up for failure or success in doing this. And they say, we can't do that. And so he says, just as I thought, you were bunch of frauds, and he orders them all executed. One of those arrested and ordered to be executed is Daniel. And so very boldly and humbly, Daniel asks for an audience with the king. We can pick it up in verse 27. It says, look at this, no wise man, incantor, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery that he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Then King Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 46, after he tells him the dream and interpretation, he falls prostrate before Daniel, paid honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. And then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him, and he made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon. And look at this, placed him in charge of all its wise men. This is the first time that we see wise men entering history through the Bible. And so you have this pagan king. He essentially believes that this group is fakes and frauds. He's allowed to see and hear, though, from the one true God. And then he puts this godly man, who God had allowed to be taken into captivity. The king puts this man in charge of all the wise men. It's a very interesting story. There are a couple of other references in the book of Daniel. In chapter 4, for example, King Nebuchadnezzar, he has another dream, and he calls for an interpretation. Verse 6, so I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners come, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret for me. Finally, Daniel comes into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is now called Belteshazzar, so he has been given a name, a Babylonian name. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here's my dream, interpret for me. So at this point, Daniel interprets the dream. It's not a dream about the future of the world. It is now a dream that's specifically about King Nebuchadnezzar himself. At this point, Daniel has gone from a captive young man to now a very highly placed, highly honored man within a pagan organization. Now, the question you might have following up, just common question, well, if he's got this prominent place, then how come he got thrown in the lion's den? And that is a good question. This actually happens with a new king. His name is Darius. King Darius, chapter 6. It says, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. So just to give you kind of a layout, this would be in the Babylonian kingdom proper, just the small isolated area. So it'd be like 120 mayors, maybe. And then above those mayors would be 3 individuals who would be more like governors of a particular area. The satraps were made accountable to them. One of those 3 was Daniel. And then look, verse 3, it says, he had become so distinguished among the administrators and the satraps that by his exceptional qualities, the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. It was at this time that the administrators and satraps, you could call them set traps, because that's what they did. They set a trap for him. And they said, we can't find anything wrong with this guy because he doesn't do anything wrong. He's honest. And so the only thing we can do is find something that would be against the law of God. And so they concocted this plan that no one would pray to anyone other than the king. And so they knew Daniel wasn't going to do that, and that's how they set the trap for him. So it actually wasn't the Magi who did this. It was the set traps. The next time we see the wise men is in the book of Esther. Now we've moved from the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire. It begins with the king of the day. His name is Xerxes. He's holding a 7-day banquet for all the people of the land, from the least to the greatest, it says. And on day 7, he's like, I've just got a really great idea. Husbands, you probably understand this. I know what I'll do. I'll parade my wife in front of everybody to show her off. What an honor that would be. Her name is Vashti, and she says, I'm not doing that. Like many of you wives would probably say, yeah, I'm not doing that. It says that the king became furious, and he burned with anger. Problem is, he doesn't know what to do. There's a reason for that. Look at verse 13, Esther chapter 2. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times. So we've seen the wise men transition from kind of a weird sect to now the ones who have the expertise in the matters of law and justice. And then it says that they had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he reigns from 605 to 562 BC during the Babylonian Empire. Xerxes I reigns from 486 to 465 BC. So not quite, approximately 150 years you have these wise men who have grown from advisors to the king to now a place of prominence where the king can't even do anything without consulting and getting permission from these wise men. In fact, history says that the Magi had become so powerful at this point that in order for a Persian king to assume power, they had to have two things. They had to be fully versed in the teachings of the Magi. And second, they had to be approved by a group of Magi that were like a senate, a ruling group. They were called the Magistanes. So the Magi are now, or the wise men you might say, they have now become earthly kingmakers because nobody can become king without their consent. They alone had the power to select a king. Now you might say, what does that have to do with Christmas? I'm on my way. I'm on my way. Fast forward 500 years to the days of Christ. At this time, the Roman Empire is now in control. But there's another empire that's still holding on to some territory out east. It's called the Parthian Empire. And it's an evolution of the old Medo-Persian Empire. They're still, like I say, holding on. I've got a map here that can show you a little bit of the territory that they controlled. The next map shows a little bit broader. So here's the Roman Empire. So they are the world power. And yet the Parthian over there in the yellow, they're still holding on. And the star on this map is Jerusalem. Still with me? Okay. So the Roman power is the superpower. They have the local area even into Israel at this point. But they've put somebody in place in power in Jerusalem. His name is Herod the Great. In Matthew chapter 2, it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. So back to that previous map. So you see the star, Magi from the east. They're coming from the Parthian Empire. It says, they asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. In verse 3, it says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. Now, we've had the opportunity to look at the Herod family throughout the years. In some places, the family tree doesn't fork. It's a really tyrannical family, a pagan family. But so this is the dad, the patriarch of all of the Herod kings that are throughout the New Testament. You might find it very interesting. He was an economic genius and yet a tyrant. He was known for building theaters and amphitheaters. He built a port. He built markets and temples, housing facilities, palaces. Now, I've just got a picture, maybe the big picture of the temple. We've looked at this several times. This is a model that you can find in modern-day Jerusalem. But this is what they believe that the temple. So as we look at the Gospels, it says Jesus taught in the temples. This entire area, you see the columns all around, that is the size of 15 football fields. Okay? That's huge. And over here in the corner, these four towers, that's the fortress of Antonia. That's where Pilate would live when he was in Jerusalem. And so that last week in Passion Week, when Jesus is teaching throughout the temple, he's moving. I mean, this is massive. I mean, you've been to Lambeau Field. You just have to understand. I mean, this is huge. And so as Jesus is cleaning out the temple on the first day, the market would be in the colonnade all around. And so it wasn't the market throughout this entire area. It was certain spaces. And then in the middle is actually called Herod's temple. Herod built this entire thing. There's another picture that's a little bit closer of Herod's temple. It was beautiful. It took 40 years to build that thing. So this is what Herod did. But at the same time, he was jealous. He was insecure. He was violent. He had his wife murdered, her two sons murdered, her brother murdered, her grandfather murdered, her mother murdered. Guys, don't get any ideas? He was a violent man. And his rise to power actually plays into this story. If we go back to that Roman Empire picture, Herod was elevated to this regional power around 40 BC. He actually followed his father, who was a previous governor. And in this time, the Parthians invade this space. And Herod flees to Rome, but then he comes back with the Roman military, and together with his army, they fight back the Parthians. And for that reason, Caesar appointed him king of the Jews. So that's when he got his kingship, if you will. It was really more of a governorship, but he liked the term king. They called him king of the Jews, even though he was not actually a Jew. Herod was an Edomite, which is, they have the same father, Isaac, but Edomites come from Esau's line. Israel, the Jewish nation, comes from Jacob's line. So remember the Magi, go back to the Magi, they were modern day king makers. And they were now the ruling party of the Parthian Empire. And at this time, at the time of Jesus' birth, they had some real problems with their current king. His name was Phraates IV. And so they deposed him. He was a weak king. They moved him out of power. And so now they're looking for a new king. And 30 years earlier, they've been moved out. They tried to take over this area. They were moved out by Herod, essentially leading this army. And so now they're coming back. Now, think with me and the nativity set that you have at your house, okay? Because I'm about to completely wreck it. It's my favorite part of the message. You got 3 men riding on camels, right? Probably have 1 on a camel and 2 walking, whatever. I mean, you think that's just what you're thinking about, right? All the movies set it up. Your nativity scene sets it up. But look again at verse 3 of Matthew chapter 2. It says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed. Now, the Greek word for this is the word tarasso. We get our word terrified from it. It means panic-stricken or terrified. Now, this is Herod the Great. He's got a kingdom and an army. If 3 men riding on camels come up, why would he be terrified of that? I wouldn't be terrified of that. You wouldn't be terrified of that. Because that's not what happened. History records that the Megastani, the Senate of kingmakers, when they would travel, they would not travel on camels. When you think about Persia, outside of rugs, what's the animal that you think about? Stallions. I mean, Persian, Arabian stallions, right? And history shows that when they would travel in groups of 50 or 100 on stallions, and they would be accompanied by as many as 1,000 cavalry. So now now that you know the backstory, you can understand this verse. If 50 to 100, decked out, but back in that day, they didn't have banks. They wore their wealth on their clothing and on their person. They're coming in, riding on massive Arabian stallions into Jerusalem, accompanied by a cavalry of as many as 1,000 soldiers. And they say, where's the king of the Jews? Where's the one who has been born king of the Jews? They're without a king. They're the earthly kingmakers. They're looking for a king. And Herod is the one that 30 years ago pushed him out. And here they come riding in to Jerusalem. And now you can understand why he's terrified. And look how it goes on. It says, and all Jerusalem with him. In spite of all that Herod did for the Jews, he was not loved, he was hated and feared. And Herod knew this, and he hated them back. In fact, when Herod was on his deathbed, he had all the prominent men from every village in the Jewish nation arrested until his death, and he said this, I know well enough that the Jews will keep a festival upon my death. However, it is in my power to be mourned for on other accounts. Send soldiers to these men that are now in custody and slay them immediately upon my death. Then all Judea and every family with them will weep. So if they're not going to weep and mourn for me, then I'll do something that will make them mourn and weep when I'm gone. And that's exactly what happened. So when the wise men come riding to town, King Herod is disturbed. And if Herod's not happy, then there's nobody happy. And so all Jerusalem is disturbed as well. Okay, I'm going to make one more change to your nativity scene. Verse 3. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go worship him. After that, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That, by the way, is the only biblical reference for the number 3. It doesn't mean there were 3 people. It just lists 3 specific gifts. And having been warned by a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Here's the deal. The wise men were not at the manger. They weren't at the manger anymore. Look at verse 9. It says, the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place the child was. Verse 11 says, on coming to the house. In verse 12, it says they returned to their country by another route. If you look at that map, you're talking about hundreds of miles that they had to travel. The song even says it. We 3 kings of Orient are bearing gifts, we traverse afar. It wasn't a one-night trip. They have come from another country, and it would take some time. Now, because I love you, I will allow you to keep your wise men in your nativity scene. Just understand that's practicing false religion, and you can deal with that between you and the Lord. Verse 16 says, when Herod realized they had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he learned from the Magi. At this time, most scholars believe Jesus is about 18 months old. Isn't it interesting how tradition overtakes truth? And we just go on as if it is. Worship team can come up and just kind of bring this in for a landing with a couple of points here. First, no matter what's going on in your life, good, bad, certain, uncertain, job loss, relationships, financial, health, know this: God is in control. God is in control. Daniel, if he can take a situation like the one Daniel was in and set on a course that hundreds of years later would play a role in identifying Jesus as king, he would make them ultimately king makers, then he can take your situation and turn it into good. He's in control. And the truth is, he wants to use whatever's going on in your life for his glory. These wise men, it's interesting. These wise men would have known all about Daniel's prophecies. He had risen to such a place of prominence in the Babylonian Empire that centuries later, this group that would have grown in their influence, they still would have known. And how do we know that? Because they saw the star. He can take astrologists who are worshiping stars and give them a star, which I believe was God's glory. It's just God's glory hanging in the sky, pointing down to the Messiah. And he can take a group of pagan priests who have no background in God or godly things, no desire, and he can use them as an instrument for his glory. History is his story, and he can use your story. Second, God reveals himself to those who are looking for him. As I said, the Magi, they were not godly in a way that we would recognize someone as a godly person. And in fact, even though Daniel himself was a godly man, there's no record that he led others to righteousness. There's no record of that at all. In fact, he was surrounded by jealousy. And yet they still heard the prophecies. And I believe they were looking for the sign. And they saw it. And God used their fake religion, their false religion, to reveal himself through a star. Now, I want you to contrast that with the Jewish leaders. Look at verse 4 and 5. When he called together, that's Herod, all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said, in Bethlehem in Judea, for this is what the prophet has written. It's a direct quote from Micah chapter 5. Now, I want you to notice what's not in there. They don't say, well, that's a really good question. Let us go back and research that. I'm not sure. Give us a little bit of time and we'll go back and we'll study the scriptures and we'll come back and tell you. No, they knew exactly where the Messiah was to be born. And get this, it was 4 miles away. These wise men saw a sign, and then they came from perhaps hundreds of miles looking for a king. And all the while, those chief priests and the teachers of the law, they're 4 miles away, and they never saw it. And they didn't go look. And then when they're confronted with the king, they rejected him. And they put him to death. John chapter 1 says this, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. And he was in the world. And though the world was made through him, the world didn't recognize him. He came to that which was his own, and his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to all those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. first people outside of Mary and Joseph, the first people to recognize Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords was a group of pagan men who God had placed over centuries in a place of prominence and king-making to say, that's him. Why? Because they were looking. Are you looking? He came unto his own, but his own received him not. That's the story. They're critically important to his story.